It's my pleasure to introduce Aditi Sheshadri, whom we're very lucky to have here as an assistant professor at Stanford in the Earth System Science department. So Aditi is not only a machine learning researcher, but she also has deep domain expertise, obtaining a PhD in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences from MIT. She's also won many awards, including the Google Scholar Award and a Simon Society of Fellows Award. Her work addresses fundamental questions in atmospheric dynamics, which she solves using a combination of theory, observation, and comprehensive numerical experiments. So I'm excited to hear from her. Welcome, Aditi. Please help me welcome Aditi.
Thank you so much for having me. Please excuse my mask. Shakir was talking of first, and I had my first baby 2.5 months ago, so I'd rather not take home anything to him, so I'm going to keep my mask on. Anyway, so my talk is going to be about something that's kind of similar to the weather prediction problem, but something that I think of as a bit more complicated, but is the climate problem. And I'm going to attempt to tell you about 2 ways in which my group has been using AI or data-informed methods in general towards helping us out on this rather complicated problem. And we're going to focus today on a physical problem known as atmospheric gravity waves. So if you've ever seen these beautiful looking cloud formations that you see off the coast of Africa here, they're a sign of these atmospheric gravity waves. These are not gravitational waves. If you are a physicist, there's no fluctuations in space-time. This is more about buoyancy fluctuations in the atmosphere, and they are ubiquitous. They're forced everywhere. Anytime you see a storm or air moving over a mountain, something like that, you set off atmospheric gravity waves, and they're a huge part of the Earth's climate. I assume I do that to go forward. The green? Yeah, there we go. Okay. So the big takeaway from this slide that I would like you to understand is that climate projections are hugely uncertain. So all climate models basically, sorry, is there a pointer or? No, okay. So all climate models basically numerically solve the Navier-Stokes equations on grids on a sphere, as I've pointed out over there. And these grids are typically like 100 by 100 kilometers wide. And so this climate model doesn't know the difference between, say, LA and the Bay Area, or doesn't know the difference between New York and Boston, okay? So even on the global scale, every climate model, if you want to know how much global mean surface temperature will change in 100 years, will give you a different answer. And on a regional scale, these climate projections can be highly uncertain, particularly with dynamical variables like rainfall, like Shakir already mentioned. And the reason for this is that many of the motions of the atmosphere that are smaller than 100 kilometers are simply not resolved. So these are known as the subgrid scales of motion, and they have to be a guess about what they're doing with respect to the variables that we can resolve have to be put into the model. So these are these subgrid scales, which are actually hugely problematic. One of those subgrid scales is atmospheric gravity waves, which caught my attention a few years ago. So atmospheric gravity waves, as I've already said, are ubiquitous. They're forced everywhere in the atmosphere. They form whenever you have upward flow in the atmosphere, in essence, whenever you have a storm, whenever you have a tropical cyclone, when you have a jet forming in the atmosphere, adjusting. So they're forced everywhere on the Earth. They propagate thousands of miles, both vertically and horizontally. And they influence the mean state of the climate. On the right here, I'm just showing you some fluctuations because of these atmospheric gravity waves. And they're a classic example of why fluid dynamics is still so challenging, because they are multi-scale. They can vary from being on scales of a meter to tens of thousands of kilometers. They have a whole range of frequencies as well, and so they cannot be resolved. We don't have good observations of these atmospheric gravity waves, particularly the higher frequency ones that vary on smaller length scales. But yet, they impact the scales that we do care about. So these atmospheric gravity waves, we think, form 1/3 of the budget of the jet stream, which everyone's familiar with. If the jet stream slows down or speeds up, you would be able to get from Boston to London in less or more time. So this is the classic example of geophysical fluid dynamics and of a process that is too small to resolve, yet has an impact on scales that we do care a great deal about. So when I came to this problem, it seemed completely unapproachable, but we turned to AI, or data-informed methods, to maybe tell us a little bit more about how we could possibly represent this process in a model without resolving the crap out of it, basically. Now, there are various problems with how atmospheric gravity waves are currently represented in climate models. Firstly, in existing climate models, they're only allowed to go straight up, just vertically upwards, and that's a convenient approximation because of the way that climate models are currently set up, but then it's completely inaccurate. Atmospheric gravity waves are not observationally validated. I'll tell you a little bit more about some very exciting new observations towards the end of the talk if we get there on time. And they depend on under-resolved sources themselves. So if you have a parcel of air that is rising in the atmosphere, that is likely to set off an atmospheric gravity wave when it convects, so when there's rain. And those processes are themselves under-resolved. So this seems like a seemingly impossible problem. And if I had a pointer, I would show you here. What I'm showing you on the left and the center is two different integrations of the same climate model with an increased CO2 kind of a climate, with the only difference being one parameter associated with this atmospheric gravity wave approximation. So, and we don't know the difference between these two integrations, and that these two parameter values are equally feasible. And given that that is the case, the right panel shows you the difference in a surface pressure variable. So we are forecasting out vastly different temperatures and pressures over the Arctic, which is a very interesting region, just because of this one parameter value. So that's where we are at this time. So I'd like to tell you about two different things that my group has been working on over the last several years on this problem. The first is, let's take our representation of atmospheric gravity waves in a climate model, throw it out, and replace it with AI. That's the first approach. The second approach is, let's keep our physics-based representation of atmospheric gravity waves, but try and include uncertainty quantification using AI-based tools. So I'll try and tell you about both of these, depending on how I'm doing with respect to time. So in the first approach, we are going to take our atmospheric gravity wave parameterization and replace it with a neural network. That's what I'm showing you here. So it's a pretty simple neural network. It's got a large number of trainable parameters because of the number of inputs that go into it, basically. But what we've done is trained an NN with every resolved variable from a climate model, and with the output of the NN being just the drag associated with these atmospheric gravity waves. So the effect that the atmospheric gravity waves have on the mean flow. This is just showing you the architecture of the NN. I'm sure nobody in this audience needs this really, but that's what it looks like. And the good news is that it seems to do pretty well. So what I'm showing you here is the drag associated with these atmospheric gravity waves. On the left from our NN, which we dub WaveNet, we thought it was a nice name. The one on the right is our physics-based atmospheric gravity wave parameterization. And in the center is the difference, the physics-based one minus WaveNet. This, by the way, was the work of Zach Espinosa, who was a computer science undergrad, who then showed up and worked in my lab for a couple of years. So the good news is that if you look at RMS error, things like that, WaveNet is actually doing pretty well. So WaveNet does about as well as the existing physics-based atmospheric gravity wave parameterization. Of course, the point here is not that it should do just as well as what currently exists, but that was the starting point. Now, this is an oscillation in the tropical atmosphere known as the quasi-biennial oscillation, which we think is mostly driven by atmospheric gravity waves. And What I'm showing you here is some differences between what WaveNet does and the existing gravity wave parameterization does. Sometimes WaveNet will overestimate the drag because of these breaking atmospheric gravity waves, but it's doing really, really, really well. And I think I'm going to go so far as to say that this is the first completely data-driven parameterization that has been coupled back to a global climate model. Amazingly, it is stable when the model is run online. So each time the model requires the effect of these waves, it calls WaveNet. WaveNet gives it a number. And we've run hundreds of years of integration with this model. With WaveNet coupled to the model, it's online, and it's reasonably accurate. And this is, again, this QBO that I was talking about, the quasi-biennial oscillation. And we've got the existing gravity wave parameterization on the top and WaveNet at the bottom. It's basically doing a pretty good job. One of the big problems with using AI for several of the problems associated with using AI for anything is A, generalizability, and B, interpretability. So if you want to look into this a little bit more, I've put the paper up there, and I'm happy to share. We tried to take apart the NN using interpretability, things such as SHAP values. And we think that the NN has actually done a pretty good job in learning the inherent relationship between breaking atmospheric gravity waves and the mean flow. We think it's doing something that's physically meaningful. And interestingly, the AI does about as well as it behaves like the model would behave in the absence of the AI in an increased CO2 climate. So that's what I'm showing you here. Forget all of the various panels. Just look at the bottom two. This is the change in the wind structure of the atmosphere in a quadruple CO2 climate, so that's a huge change. And WaveNet is qualitatively matching the original climate model. So we think that somehow, magically, it's doing pretty well. So that's sort of my first story. Of course, the point would be to train WaveNet not on the model itself, but perhaps on very high resolution integrations which actually resolve some of these atmospheric gravity waves, and or on observations. And I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. On to my second story, which is uncertainty quantification. Perhaps this is a rather equation-y slide, excuse me. But so these atmospheric gravity wave parameterizations, or any parameterization in general, assumes some value for parameters. And we can use AI techniques to actually, instead of carrying one parameter through the system, carry a distribution of parameters through the system. Forgive the detail, but think of this as just an inverse problem. We want to get some feature of the climate right based on some number associated with these parameters. So that's what, if I had a pointer, I would be pointing at the bottom. And our forward model here is a climate model, which is inherently expensive to run. So we'd like to develop some sort of calibration and uncertainty quantification procedure which doesn't involve running a climate model a million times. Okay? So that's what we're trying to do here. And I'll walk you through it in a few more slides. But we're going to use ensemble Kalman inversion coupled with a Gaussian process emulator to help us do this. So the first step here is that we're going to calibrate parameters to some sort of truth, which could be observations, using ensemble Kalman inversion. We're going to build a Gaussian process emulator of our forward model, that is the climate model, and then sample from the Gaussian process emulator to give us probability distribution functions rather than just a single value. So let's go back to this quasi-biennial oscillation that I was talking about and think about parameters associated with the atmospheric gravity wave parameterization. Don't worry too much about the details. What I'm showing you here is every iteration of the ensemble Kalman inversion, which is basically setting off a number of forward model integrations, 10 at each iteration. And you can see that this ensemble Kalman inversion is pushing us closer and closer to the truth at each iteration. Each iteration involves about 10 model integrations, not too long. And so the optimized climate variables are being pushed towards what we would like them to be, and the parameters are also converging towards something like what we would like them to be. Given all of these integrations from the ensemble Kalman inversion, we can then build a Gaussian process emulator, which is what I'm showing you here, and then use the output from the Gaussian process emulator with a Monte Carlo type process to sample these two parameter values that I'm thinking about on the x and the y axes of these to form a probability distribution function of how these parameters map on to the optimized values. So that's basically what this is. Having done this, we can then build up a nice probability distribution function, which I'm showing you there. It looks kind of like a banana. We've been referring to this as the banana PDF. And it tells you what parameters of these parameterizations give you something like the observed macrophysical climate. You can see here that one parameter has been pretty narrowly constrained by this process, the one on the right. And the top parameter, a whole range of values is perfectly fine. Having done this, we can then sample from this posterior PDF to give us a range of climate outputs. So for instance, if this parameter changes from 10 to 12, how would extreme rainfall over California change? That's an important thing to know for people who are actually trying to plan for these changes in extreme rainfall over California. In this case, concerningly, small changes in these two parameters can actually make quite a huge difference to your climate state. Papers are up there. I'm happy to share and tell you more about all of this. But I thought I would also talk a little bit about the data, because the AI has to be trained on something. And an exciting development on the atmospheric gravity wave front over the last several years has been Project Loon. Can I see a show of hands who's heard of Loon? That's more than I typically get, actually. So Loon came out of Google a few years ago, out of Alphabet at least, a few years ago. And they are these super pressure balloons that have been floating. Well, they were launched over New Zealand to begin with, but now they have reasonably global coverage. They were launched to provide internet access to everyone below the balloons, but they're an incidental source of really great data for atmospheric gravity waves. They provide pretty global coverage. They collect data every 60 seconds, which is quite remarkable for my purposes. And they also have really good geographical coverage as well. I'll show you that in a little bit. And they just happen to measure things like latitude, longitude, height, temperature, and pressure in the atmosphere about every 60 seconds. So this is just absolutely invaluable and completely free data. This is what the distribution of the balloons looks like. This is color-coded by month of the year. And in my group, we have been using these balloons to provide observational constraints on these waves in the upper atmosphere, these atmospheric gravity waves that I've been going on about for the last 15 minutes or so. So we are combining these observational constraints, which are really quite invaluable, with extremely high resolution global integrations of a model. So what I'm showing you on the left is how do I go back? Okay, so what I'm showing you on the left is an extremely high resolution but regional model run for a very short period of time. And on the right is again a very high resolution that should be animated. I'm not going to bother too much. Of a global model, but 2.5 kilometer resolution in the horizontal. With respect to a climate model, that's 100 kilometers, so it's a huge, huge, huge difference. Again, run for a short time. Similarly, some more on the right here. This is ECMWF's integrated forecast system, actually, run at 1 kilometer resolution. And on the left is data from Loon. So what we are currently working on is combining all of these high-resolution data sets with the observational constraints provided by Loon in order to train the AI on something like this, or use something like this as constraints for our calibration problem. I see that I have about a minute left, so I'm just going to wrap up and tell you a little bit about DataWave. I lead a project named DataWave. It is funded by Schmidt Futures. I have 8 co-PIs, all of whom are pictured here. So it's a team of about 30 people. It's a really fun, collaborative project involving models at different levels of complexity and observations of Loon, other observations, satellite observations, AI in different forms, calibration, uncertainty quantification, using AI as a substitute for the model, even going all the way up to there. So, and at any given time, we are looking for PhD students or postdocs or even undergrads, particularly if you are good at AI, please do get in touch. We would love to have some new blood on board. So having said all of that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions. Okay.
Thanks, Aditi. So I was told we should grab a seat during the question session. Yeah, are there any, so people can ask questions on Slido or from the audience. I'll ask the first question. You raised the question of sort of the long-term validity of these simulations, and as we both know, sort of errors can accumulate as you iterate a dynamical model. But then there's also the just so story of a butterfly flaps its wings in the Atlantic, yes, and there's a hurricane in the US. So there's this inherent chaoticity in the climate. So how do you know if your simulations are working well long-term? And is that just so story correct? Like, how chaotic is the climate?
Right. So there's two different problems here. Predicting the weather is where these tiny errors in initial conditions creeps in over multiple days. Predicting the climate is an inherently different problem because climate is the statistics of weather. And so running a model in a completely different climate would not, so I would not be able to tell you anything about what the temperature or the rainfall is going to be on June 1st, 2026. That is a meaningless problem. However, I can tell you something about what it's likely to be. I can say something about what the PDF of temperature in 2100 is likely to be. It's not going to be accurate on a given date. It's not going to be accurate on a given month. However, the long-term statistics will be somewhat meaningful. So it's two different problems.
I see, got it.
Yeah.
And so how do you, just a follow-up question, how do you validate the predictions of long-term statistics, and how do you do it, like uncertainty quantification, like you so nicely showed in that setting? How do you do it for long-term future predictions of the statistics of climate?
So the short answer is you cannot, because it is hard to predict, particularly the future, as we all know. The best that we can do is come up with parameter values that seem to be both physically meaningful and that give you a climate state that matches the current climate. That's about all you can do. Yeah, you cannot really validate the future, but you can, radiative calculations we know are incredibly accurate. So if you increase CO2 by a certain amount or increase methane by a certain amount, the temperature changes associated with that, on the average, are pretty accurate.
I see.
Dynamical changes, such as changes in wind, changes in rainfall, are not.
I see.
So the uncertainties associated with dynamical variables are huge. Uncertainties associated with temperature are much less so.
Got it. Any questions from the audience? We have one from Slido, which is that AI for weather forecasting requires high precision GPUs, i.e. 64-bit. Most AI cases today use LLMs, which are surprisingly different, like low numbers of bits. Do you foresee some kind of segmentation in the silicon market for AI? Are there opportunities for new chipsets to challenge NVIDIA? This is a very Silicon Valley question.
It's a very Silicon Valley question, and I figure there must be people in the audience who have more thoughts on that than I do. But I will say that adapting, so climate models don't run on GPUs, and that's one of the existing problems that we are contending with, the CPU-GPU problem. As also the other thing which the person did not ask about, but the climate models are in Fortran and our AI model,
oh my goodness.
Indeed.
Wow.
So talking between Python and Fortran has been another of the sort of nuts and bolts issues that we've had to deal with over the last few years.
So when I was doing galaxy simulations as an undergraduate at MIT, I had to program in Fortran.
Right.
And I quit pretty soon, actually. But anyways, that's very interesting. I mean, well, I have more to ask you about that, but let's not dive down that rabbit hole. Let's see. I was actually curious. I mean, multi-scale modeling is a challenge across many, many fields, right? So I was curious if you could say a little bit more about how you coupled the WaveNet, which, as I understood, models gravity waves at a fine scale, to the global models, as I understood it, have a pretty large grid size. So how do those two models communicate with each other across scales? What information is exchanged? How do they help each other?
Right. So atmospheric gravity waves, just like waves break on a beach, tend to break at different parts of the atmosphere. And when they break, they deposit momentum. So they provide a forcing on the momentum of the resolved flow. So what WaveNet or any other atmospheric gravity wave parameterization would do is just provide a deceleration on the flow that is resolved. So that's basically what WaveNet does.
So it exerts forces on the large-scale grids for the global climate model.
Exactly.
Interesting. And while we have you here, I'd love to hear your opinions about or prognostications about the future of human society in the context of climate change. Like what do you think is going to happen?
I tend to be optimistic.
Okay.
So this isn't a problem. It's a challenge. It's not a problem that was brought about by evil per se. I think it's a technological challenge and a societal challenge, and one that we will address.
Well, so just to double click on that, what are your sources of optimism?
I'm an optimistic person. No, I think that technologically it is an addressable problem. And I even feel we have the tools to address it. It's just a question of getting there.
What do you think the biggest, like if you were in control of policy, what would be the biggest levers that you pull to address this problem? Sorry to put you on the spot, but for a broad audience, I think this would be very interesting. Yeah, very easy questions.
Very easy questions. Well, investment in renewables. I'm not going to say a carbon tax, but maybe that.
Okay. You just lost a lot of funding. I'm kidding. So just to go back to a technical question, that this business of enforcing conservation laws, I know in a lot of physics-informed machine learning, that's incredibly important to do. In Navier-Stokes, there's momentum conservation, energy conservation. What are other interesting conservation laws? How well are those conservation laws enforced? How does that help you maintain stability of the simulation and so forth?
Right. So there are physics-informed neural networks at which you can enforce whatever conservation law you like. Navier-Stokes is conservation of mass momentum and energy, which you can enforce with a physics-informed neural network. With a purely AI model would not enforce any of those, which is why there is a stability issue. But this is an ongoing question. I mean, that was an unfair question to Shakir, really, because it's one that we're all grappling with. And particularly with this parameterization question as well, it's an interesting thing because the parameterization, whether it's AI-based or whether it's physics-based, is not required to enforce conservation laws. So it's an ongoing problem. Yeah.
Okay, if there's no other questions from the audience, let's
there's one up
maybe
there.
one. Let's take the last question from way back there. I think microphone's coming.
Hi, thank you. So you describe application of AI as a surrogate of some first principle models, right? And surrogate modeling is uncertainty quantification and uncertainty propagation is really a cornerstone of it because that's what keeps it honest, right? So you also mentioned that UQ is difficult or almost impossible in this kind of models. How do you see solving this dilemma? Because it is a big problem if we're looking at predictions that are actionable. Right? If we start plugging in surrogates that are unquantifiable in uncertainty, that creates a lot of problems.
Right. So there's uncertainty quantification for completely AI-based subgrid scale modeling, and that can be done. I mean, you can do your training on different subsets of data. As an example, you could use dropout methods. You could use Bayesian neural networks. You could do things like that and come up with an estimate of uncertainty even for a completely AI-based subgrid scale model or a surrogate model is what I think you called it. So there are methods that you could apply. And for physics-based parameters as well, there are methods that you could apply. I showed you ensemble Kalman inversion, but then you could also do something like Bayesian history matching, something like that. So there are methods you could apply, and that would give you a range of outputs. The question then is, for the person who is making decisions based on that range of outputs, like how seriously do you take that range? Do you put an additional like factor of safety on that? Like how do you deal with that, right? That's the question, which thankfully we don't have to answer, but the person who is taking action based on those predictions does have to think about. And yeah, that's one of those things where there is no good answer, right? Because, yeah.
Okay, let's thank Aditi one more time. Thanks so much. Okay, and next I'd like to introduce Pratyusha Sharma, who is currently a PhD student at MIT working with Antonio Torralba and Jacob Andres. So Pratyusha has already distinguished herself as being the youngest speaker, I believe, at the symposium. She already has a broad portfolio of research in understanding what can be learned from rich multimodal interactions with objects and people in the world, as well as how to use these insights to empower robots to reason and interact in the real world. She's also an integral member of a SETI collaboration in which she uses her expertise in machine learning to decipher the secret language of whales. And I'm very much looking forward to learning about this. Let's please welcome Pratyusha. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. So let's start by watching this video.
I'm human. What are you?
So in the movie Arrival, an alien species visits the Earth and initiates a dialogue with humans. They do this by producing these sounds and by writing in the circular script on this mysterious screen. The movie follows the journey of a linguist to interactively understand the communication system of the species while trying to teach them a little bit of our own. Communication is a key characteristic of intelligence. Being able to create an infinite number of messages by composing a finite set of sounds is a key trait that distinguishes human beings from other species on Earth. Understanding the communication system of a species and its complexity helps us understand their intelligence, their cognition, their environment, and also their culture. Further, it'll also help us understand how our own language system might have evolved. But before we start to think about alien communication, there are millions of life forms on Earth with distinctive sounds and communication strategies. They have their own physical and mental constraints and have their own unique ecosystems and societies. However, we know very little about their communication systems. So, how do we decipher the communication system of another species and possibly even communicate back? I'm Pratyusha Sharma. I'm a graduate student at MIT in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, where I, along with my wonderful advisors and the incredible team of Project SETI, study this question. Today, I'm going to show you how, as a computer scientist, I could contribute to this really exciting project. Project SETI is a nonprofit organization with researchers from around the world with backgrounds in biology, cryptography, robotics, linguistics, and artificial intelligence. However, it's mainly based out of the country of Dominica in the Caribbean, which is home to the sperm whales. At Project SETI, we want to first understand the communication of sperm whales. Sperm whales are animals with the largest brain to have ever existed on the planet, and they've had it for 16 million years longer than us. Sperm whales use sounds to both echolocate and perceive their environment, as well as to communicate. They live in complex matriarchal societies with multi-generational bonds. The members of the family coordinate their dives, socialize with each other, and even take turns babysitting each other's young ones. While coordinating in complete darkness, they exchange long sequences of sounds with one another. So we know that they're communicating. We just don't know how they're doing it and what is it that they're saying. And that is what we have set out to find. Sperm whales sound something like this. They produce these short packets of clicks, and if their clicks were to be represented by vertical dashes, it would look something like this. Their clicks are not random, but are more structured. The communication sounds of sperm whales are believed to be made up of distinct sequences of clicks called codas. Past research has identified 21 discrete coda types in the Caribbean, and a subset of these have been shown to contain information about the speaker's identity as well as their clan identity. However, almost everything else about the sperm whale communication system, including questions about its structure and information carrying capacity, remain unknown. So what even makes this problem challenging? Sperm whales live in a completely different ecosystem and can produce and hear sounds very differently than us. Additionally, unlike the setting from Arrival, the whales did not already come forth to us with the intent of teaching us their language. And we may not even be able to interactively learn from them from the get-go. Hence, to start, we want to largely be able to understand their communication system through a static data set containing recordings of their sounds as well as their behavior. The other added complexity to this problem is the data collection itself. We do not want to study animals in captivity or pursue teaching the animal our own language. And we largely want to be able to understand the naturally arising communication system of the species in the wild, and do so while being minimally invasive. This pretty much decides the process by which we can collect the data. The data obtained for the study is collected by tagging whales with these stick-on tags. These tags record their sounds as well as their motion. And sperm whales are the size of a school bus. And for people who have been whale watching, you probably know how very briefly whales surface on the top of the ocean for 10 or so minutes. And it is in that duration that these tags need to be placed. So as you can imagine, collecting data of this kind is extremely difficult, and the data is very sparse and precious. So given this data, what might the communication of sperm whales even look like? Is it like the crab and cuttlefish, where a few fixed gestures indicate current environmental conditions? Or is it like the vervet monkeys, where a fixed set of gestures and their combinations warn other monkeys about predators and their locations? Or is it like the human language, capable of conveying a range of complex meanings and fairly abstract ideas? One of the key differentiators between human communication and all known animal communication systems is this property called duality of patterning. It's how a base set of individually meaningless elements or phonemes get sequenced together to form words that carry meaning, which in turn can be sequenced together to generate an infinite space of complex meanings. For example, the sound "b" here by itself does not mean anything, but it's combined here with other meaningless sounds to give rise to the word banana, which is in turn combined with other words to convey really complex meaning, like this sentence. Getting to the point of understanding the communication of sperm whales will require us to understand what features of their voices do they control, what forms the smallest set of meaning-carrying units, or the equivalent of words in their case, how are these sounds sequenced together to exchange information and dialogues, and finally, what is it that they are communicating about? We've done some work in each of these questions, but today I will only talk about a few. So these are the visualizations of the codas that we saw previously. Going into this project, we did not know anything about whales and had no idea how to even think about this system. However, we knew that until now, sperm whales were believed to produce only a fixed set of coda types, and the contrast between the apparent simplicity of the communication system and the range of complex coordination behaviors that it enabled presented a fundamental mystery to researchers in the field. So the first thing we did was we developed a few different ways of looking at this data itself. One visualization we came up with was this one. So instead of plotting the clicks in time this way, let's plot them along two axes. On the x-axis, the position of the dot will represent when the click was made. And on the y-axis, how long after the first click in the coder the click was made. Let's also do this for the other clicks. And if we do the same thing for all whales in the conversation, each represented by different colors, we will see something like this. Let's also connect the coders made by the same whale with lines, and this will help us see how coders made by a given whale change over time. And we call this plotting style the exchange plot. Visualizing coders this way magnifies the structure within coders as well as structure across whale conversations, and it helps us visually track how coders made by individual whales evolve over time. Now, a 30-minute exchange between multiple whales starts to look like this. The exchange plot already highlights so much more variability in the sounds of the sperm whales that the visualizations of clicks as dashes just fail to capture. Let's take a closer look at one of these plots. Like I mentioned, the exchange plot magnifies the structure of the coders across the dialogues, but also within a given call at the same time. So even though the clicks did not sound like music to us, when we plot them like this, they start to look a little bit like music. They have different tempos and rhythms. And also, just by looking at this plot, you can see that they can change one feature without changing the other. Further, there are lots of other musical features, like these ornaments, for example, and these ritorandos that we call rubato. In fact, some of these axes of variation in the calls only become noticeable in the context of the rest of the calls, and therefore are contextual. But how do we know if these are controlled or just random noise in the production of the sounds itself? How do we know that they're actually intentional variations in the production of the calls? Let's take the rubato, for example. If we take the sounds of a single whale, the changes between consecutive calls are sometimes nearly of the order of 100 milliseconds. Deducing what features of a sound are controlled is not a question of only what the individual sounds look like, but also how they affect the behavior or response of another whale in the dialogue. We find that the extremely delicate modulation of durations in the coders is both perceived as well as imitated by the responding whale in the exchange. So if it really was noise and imperceptible to a listener, how could it possibly be imitated? A more in-depth analysis of the sounds in the dataset showed that the coders are not defined by a small fixed set of coder types as previously believed, but instead formed a combinatorial coding system, where coder types can be explained by the combination of the following 4 features, each of which can be independently varied. The resulting set of sounds and symbols has 8 times higher information rate than previously believed, showing that the sperm whale communication system is significantly more expressive than what was previously thought. The existence of a combinatorial coding system at either the level of sounds or sound sequences or both is a prerequisite for duality of patterning. Combinatorial vocalization systems are exceedingly rare in nature. However, their use by sperm whales shows that they're not uniquely human and can arise from dramatically different physiological, ecological, and social pressures. These results open up the possibility that sperm whale communication might provide a first example of that phenomenon in another species. Okay, so now that we have the symbols and have established aspects of their calls that are controlled, we can already start to study questions of what might the structure of these call sequences be, and what governs their call production and their turn-taking protocols. Unfortunately, I'll be a little bit intentionally vague because some of these results are under peer review and preparation. Okay, so to understand this, let's take a step back. Let's say we have the following sequences of discrete characters from an alien broadcast. How might we actually understand what the structure in this data is? Even if we have lots of data like this, finding structure in this data is really hard. We have no idea what the words of the language are, if it even has words, what rules govern how words are put together, what kinds of meanings is a species choosing to represent and communicate about. And it's especially hard if all we have is a fixed data set on which one cannot actually ask questions about new utterances. The only known machine, algorithm, or person that can figure out how to speak a language of a completely different world is a baby. Although even in that case, there is an element of interactivity. What if instead of a data set, we had an artifact, like a black box, where you could input some text and it outputs completions of texts or responses? Now we have a lot more flexibility. We can test model responses to new inputs, modified versions of the same inputs, and even generate new data. Although it's still not a complete solution, and we don't completely understand the relationship between the black box's use of language and the aliens themselves, but we can start to already generate or exclude concrete hypotheses. We have a similar situation with the whale communication data. We have an estimate of what aspects of their calls they control and have a guess of what the discrete representation of their vocalizations might be. But how can we now say something about the structure of their calls? What if only we had a black box of their communication that we could interactively probe to some degree? Given a static data set of calls, we can construct a proxy version of such a black box. Similar to a language model, we could train a next call predictor from a sequence of calls produced in the past. Having a model like this, even an imperfect one, can help us test model responses to new inputs and modified versions of seen inputs. So even without necessarily understanding how the language might be put to use, how meanings are constructed, we could already start to ask questions about the structure of these calls itself. While understanding how language models might be predicting a certain sequence of outputs over another is still challenging, we can already learn from what they're predicting and how that changes in response to changing the inputs. You could also change the expressivity of your model and observe how that changes how well you fit the data distribution. Okay, so we train a predictive model of whale vocalization over the calls of the sperm whales. Here we additionally also include information of the speaker's identities and when the calls were specifically made, because that also appears to be an important aspect of their communication system. The outputs of the model are the next calls in the sequences, also represented with the same features: who, what, and when. The features we test are if there are long-range dependencies in the calls, and if deleting specific features in the calls causes the model's predictions to change systematically. We find that the whale vocalization models improve with increasing context sizes of the inputs, showing evidence of long-range dependencies in the call structure, and we see also an improvement in the model's predictions with increasing the model's expressivity. We also find that deleting specific features in the call hurts the model's ability to predict turn changes and chorusing behavior. Black box neural models make it possible to quantify the pieces of what features of a signal carry information. This gives us a powerful jumping off point to understand the structure of this data and to conduct exploratory data analysis. Additionally, SETI is building technologies that allow us to collect large amounts of multisensory and multimodal data in Dominica with a suite of different sensors that allow for round-the-clock recording of whale sounds and aspects of their behavior and their environment. I have to say, I'm in constant awe of all the work that the hardware research team does on the side of the project. It's really cool. This will allow us to use more powerful machine learning techniques and algorithms to analyze this data and perhaps get us closer to understand the meanings of the sounds of the whales. And maybe even communicate back with them at some point. Finally, hopefully the algorithms and approaches we develop in the course of this project will empower us to better understand the other species that we share the planet with. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Pratyusha. That was fascinating. Any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Very exciting work. Now that you have the clicking sounds, can you duplicate them and see how a whale responds?
Yes, so we haven't really conducted any playback experiments so far because the population that we're studying is endangered, and we are not fully sure of what the consequences of conducting such a playback experiment might be. So we're being a little bit careful as to when we might feel confident enough to conduct such a playback experiment, and there are a lot of approvals required for such an experiment, but nothing so far. Yeah.
Fascinating talk. I wanted to ask about compositionality and if you see any signs of compositionality, which is a hallmark of human language. Maybe starting with, are there stable lexical items? You mentioned that some of the codas refer to different whales. Are they the same, the codas, or are they highly contextual? And do those get built up over larger units? Thanks.
Yes. So what I did talk about a little bit was about the combinatoriality at the phonemic sort of level. But for compositionality, one, we would need to establish what the words are and the meanings that they carry, and then be able to talk about whether there is compositionality. So we do kind of see a little bit of context, like in the diving context specifically, we see that certain coda combinations are unique to diving contexts, but we don't really yet know what are the words exactly. So we haven't really established something clear about compositionality. Yes.
Okay, great. Maybe next question.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for the fascinating talk. I'm wondering, on more of a technical level, how are you representing the information or the communications of the whales in the context of the predictive model? Is it more of like the actual audio, or is it like features of the clicks?
Yes, it's the features of the clicks that I talked about in the first half of the talk, where like we represent them with rubato, whether or not there's an ornament at the top of the click, the rhythm, and the overall duration, tempo. So it's just a vector of each of these different properties all concatenated together, not the audio yet. Yeah.
I see. Have you also considered including like the frequency of the clicks? Because just from listening to that brief thing, it seemed like the kind of frequency was another axis of variation that I heard across time, or as well as time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did try to see if whales have like specific spectral properties in the clicks itself, where they might choose to encode information. Like, are there particular frequencies that different whales make, or is there information in the power of the click itself? But right now, we have not included any of that information.
Yeah, back there.
So you mentioned that you are not able to conduct the playback research because this is an endangered species. So a couple questions. One is that why do you choose this species to study? Do you consider to choose more common animals like buffaloes or cows, those animals? And another one is that in the current state of art, as a human beings, how much we understand the communications between, say, animals, and how does that will affect the research that you are doing, and what we can do for us to understand better about their communications?
Yes. So I guess for the first part of the question, like why did we choose to work on sperm whale data? So there are like two parts to this answer. Like honest answer, it's a big collaboration, and all the different teams. The biology team are groups of scientists who work on sperm whale data. But the other answer really to this question is that sperm whales live in these complex matriarchal societies, and their communication system is kind of acquired and learned over the period of the child's, after the child's born, and it's not a system that they're born with. The second thing is that they operate in complete darkness. Like if you go into the ocean and you dive, like after 10 or 20 meters, it's complete darkness. And these are really big whales. And if they have to coordinate, they need to know each other's positions, and they need to be able to like really come into these really complex formations. And they do this all while exchanging clicks. So clearly there seems to be this contradiction between all the behaviors that they can exhibit, and they're doing this in complete darkness, and they're only exchanging sounds. So there is probably something about, there's maybe some, we don't yet understand how they're kind of encoding all this information in their calls. So it seemed like, I think that was another reason why we decided to. And was there a second question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so how do you understand the general communication among animals?
How do you understand the general? So that is what we are trying to do. So we don't know how, like, so this is a project, like I guess the steps that I described is one way to understand the general communication between animals itself. And yeah, I think that is the answer. There's no other answer I have, I guess. Yeah.
I have a question back there. While the microscope gets back there, I was curious, what kind of behaviors does language drive? Like, can you see correlations between utterances and changes in the swimming patterns of the whales or anything like that?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a great question. So so one thing that probably I did not talk about much was what kind of behavioral data do we have with these sounds, right? So we have very sparsely annotated behavioral data. One thing we know is that they do multiple dives in a day. And a pattern that we can clearly see is the calls that they make in association to just diving before they dive.
I see.
And I have to be a bit intentionally vague about like exactly what the structure of the calls are, but there are some patterns in, that kind of regulate the diving behavior that seems to be clear from the data.
So they make some calls before they dive or right after?
Yes, just before they dive.
Interesting. Do other whales then dive after that, like in groups?
Yes, so they make these calls only in the presence of other whales and when they're diving together.
So when a whale is alone, it never makes calls?
It never makes these communication calls.
I see.
Yeah.
Cool. I think, yeah, go ahead.
Very interesting talk. I have to piggyback on that question, which is when there are environmental changes or stressors, say a storm or maybe another whale is in distress, do you see a pattern or a sequence of events of the behavior of the whales that change?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. So so first of all, the amount of data we have is we don't really encounter many stressful behaviors in the current data set that we have, but there are definitely some stressors when, for example, when you place the tag, right, it can be stressful for the whale when you, in the moments when you place the tag. And there you do see some sounds that they produce that are consistently produced every time you place the tag. So that is an example where there might be an event which might become a source of stress. Outside of that, we do not have data specifically with events of stress.
Okay, maybe one more question from the audience.
Yeah, I want to find out if you use LLMs to decode. Do you use large language models? Just like for humans, can you use this? I know you use signal processing, probably use wavelets of Fourier transforms, but do you use LLMs?
Yes, so like the second part of the talk where I talked about building this predictive model over the sequence of calls, it was a model trained over discrete tokens, tokenized representations of the whale calls themselves. So you can think of it as a language model, but not necessarily a large language model because the amount of data we have currently is not that much, and we can only train models of limited expressivity because if you train a really large model, it will very quickly overfit. So not large language models, but language models of some kind, or predictive models of vocalization, because we don't yet know if it's a language, so to say. Yeah.
Okay, great. And one last question, actually, from the audience, from the online audience. I had the same question, actually. What about baby whales? Like, is their language any different? How does it develop? What about baby-mother interactions? Are they any different? Do you have data on that?
Yes, so we do not have a lot of data on that yet, but there are other scientists in the community who have observed that baby whales tend to execute a babbling kind of behavior when they start to acquire a lot of these coders. So one of the, like in the roadmap paper that Project SETI put out, one of the sections really talk about how might we go about acquiring such a data set, and but we do not have such data yet. But it's definitely a very interesting kind of data set.
That's fascinating. I used to work in birdsong, and they have a similar babbling from the baby stage to the adult stage, and they can look at neural activity patterns in the brain as the babbling is turning into adult song. But anyways, this is super fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so the last speaker of the session, I'm happy to introduce Alex Rives. Just looking at his CV, one can understand how he achieved his interdisciplinary success. He actually obtained two bachelors in Yale in philosophy and biology, and a PhD from NYU in computer science. He went on to do extremely impactful work at Meta on protein language sequence modeling. And we actually asked a local expert, Stephen Quake, about this work, and he had nothing but glowing praise for the work. He said that this was some of the first work in the space to be extremely useful to a broad array of biologists. And recently, Alex has managed to successfully raise funding for a startup based on this work, and he will also be joining the Broad Institute at MIT and Harvard. Please give Alex a warm welcome.
Okay. I'm going to talk about language models today, but not language models of human text, but rather of a language billions of years older, the language of biology. And this talk is going to focus on proteins and the sequences of proteins. Proteins have the potential to solve some of the biggest challenges that face our society. And this is just 3 examples to give you a view of kind of the range of things that proteins do and their potential applications. So the left shows something called a checkpoint inhibitor. So this is basically a drug that's had incredible success for cancer, and it basically blocks an immune evasion mechanism within cancer. The middle panel depicts an enzyme that degrades plastic. So nature has actually created many such enzymes. And so if you go out and sample the natural environment, you can find these kind of molecular machines that are capable of doing these types of functions. The right panel shows rubisco. So this is one of the most abundant enzymes on Earth. It's critical for carbon fixation. Engineering this enzyme is of great interest for climate. So the perspective we're going to take here, and this is a very, very classical, basic view of biology, but one I think that really illustrates the potential for language models here. And you can think about biology. There's this incredible technology, which is the ribosome, which is basically this molecular machine which can take in a sequence, a code for a protein, and basically manufacture that protein, that complex molecular machine at the nanoscale. And these proteins have just a myriad of functions that underlie all of life. And today we have a technology that allows us to read genome sequences and therefore read the sequences of proteins. And we can do this at very low cost and at scale. And so the largest databases of protein sequences have billions of proteins in them. Billions of these sequences which encode these incredibly complex molecular machines with this myriad of functions and capable of just incredible, beautiful dynamism. And we know their sequences, but that's close to all that we know about them. And we also have a technology which allows us to print out a gene sequence. And so to write down the sequence of a protein and put it into a cell and instruct that cell basically to manufacture any of these molecular machines. But what we really lack is a deep understanding of this language. It's a language that's written in 20 characters, basically. These characters each represent an amino acid, sort of the small scale building blocks of a protein, which is a polymer. And so these sequences fold into just intricate and dynamic structures. And so it's all in this language of the sequence, and this language of the sequence encodes the structure of the proteins and their biological function. And we're very limited in our ability to look at function and to look at structure. And so the largest databases of protein structure that have been experimentally determined have something like 300,000 structures in them. And so that contrasts with just this incredible wealth and diversity of sequence information that we have. And so it's natural to think about this as a language. And I started the talk with this, this sort of this analogy, because of course it is an analogy, because the sequence of a protein is really a chemical structure of a molecule, very different from text. But at least at a superficial level, you can write down a protein sequence in this way, and you can model it as a text. And so, everyone here is probably familiar now with the idea of language modeling. And there's two major forms of this. There's autoregressive prediction, or next word or next token prediction. To be or not to be, that is the blank. We can easily fill in the words in that soliloquy. And another form of this, which has been very important for representation learning, is masked language modeling, where we can mask out several positions within a sequence, several words, or several positions within a protein sequence, and ask the model to fill in the blanks. And what you can imagine then is the model looks at this text and has to discover the dependencies between the characters in the text. So to blank or not to blank, that is the blank. That is the task that the models that I'm going to talk about today have been trained for. And so, of course, superficially, you can write down these character sequences, you can blank out some of the characters, and you can ask the model to fill in those blanks. But this actually corresponds to a really long-standing view within biology about sort of the deep patterns within protein sequences. And so you can think about proteins, and so at the superficial level, there's this similarity. At a deeper level, there's this deep dissimilarity, because in one case, we're talking about language. The other case, we're talking about chemical structures. But then at this much deeper level, there's this principle of underlying structure in the data. And so one of the classical explanations for why language models have been so successful is a concept known as the distributional hypothesis, which basically says that the patterns in words that we observe in a large corpus of text are determined by the underlying meaning of the language. And so that meaning is imprinted into the text in such a way that to compress the text, the models must infer something about the underlying meaning. And so that is one reason why you might think that a large language model trained on sufficient data with sufficient expressiveness and capacity and parameters would be able to develop a world model within its parameters. And so with proteins, there's an interesting analogous principle, which is protein sequences are generated by random mutation, but they have to pass basically through the sieve of evolution. So only the sequences which are consistent with biological structure and function pass through that sieve, and those are the ones that we observe in large-scale sequencing studies. And so there's kind of this deep structure that's imparted via evolution onto the patterns that we see in protein sequences. And this has actually been an idea that's very critical to modern protein structure prediction. In fact, AlphaFold takes advantage of this principle, and it actually looks at a collection of evolutionarily related sequences, and it looks at the patterns within that family of sequences. So you can imagine that a language model that has been trained across millions or hundreds of millions or billions of sequences in order to compress these patterns might have to discover something about the underlying biology. And so this is the key idea in this talk, which is basically we are training mass language models on a large database of totally evolutionarily diverse proteins, tens to hundreds of millions of these proteins. And then what we'd like to do is look at the representations that develop within the model over the course of their training to understand whether there's biological information that emerges within those models. So one of the first things that we looked at, the transformer has this mechanism that's called self-attention. And basically what it is each position in a sequence is able to attend to all the other positions in the sequence. And there's a weight assigned to each of those positions in the sequence. You can imagine this almost like a graph structure, and then messages will be passed along this graph. And it's a graph that's generated for every sequence. So the network basically learns how to construct this graph. And so each of these maps, and this is shown here on the left, basically, if L is the length of the sequence, then there's an L by L attention map, which basically shows for each attention head how much does one position depend on the other position. And so one of the things that we looked at is basically, does this, after training, does this correspond to the structure of the protein, the underlying biology of the protein? So that's what's depicted on the right here. And basically for the 660 attention heads that are in this model, and so on the basically going up, we're going deeper and deeper into the network, and then the index of the head is on the x-axis here, basically. You can see that, and the color here is basically showing to what extent does the activation of that head correspond to a contact in the three-dimensional structure of the protein. So that would be when two positions in the sequence come back together in the folded 3D structure. And basically we see that deep within the network there are these heads which correspond to the contacts, and this emerges through training. And this is just a picture of it. So this information really emerges in this interpretable fashion. So you can actually project it out basically of the attention heads. And so that's showing with just 20 structures to basically identify which heads to focus on and put weight on. You can get a very clear picture of the low resolution structure of the protein out of these models. The other thing, and perhaps this isn't surprising because we're basically learning a model of the dependencies across evolution, is that there's information about the function of proteins that also develops. And so if you take, and this is an example of a DNA methylase protein, if you look at the probabilities that the model assigns to the amino acids at each position in the sequence, and you just look at the lowest entropy positions, so the ones where the model's sort of most sure about what amino acids should be there, you see that those really cluster around the functional site. And so the models really learned where the degrees of freedom in this protein are, and it's learned sort of the underlying constraints on the function. So last summer, we undertook a scaling study where we trained models over a range of parameters from 8 million to 15 billion parameters. And 15 billion is a pretty large model. Some of the state-of-the-art models in NLP are kind of at the 100 billion to a trillion parameter scale. So we're still an order of magnitude below that. But we've started to look at how does biological information relate to the expressiveness of these models, basically the parameter scale and the compute that goes into training them. And this illustrates kind of one of the patterns that we see, basically. And so as these models increase in their capacity and scale, a higher and higher resolution or more accurate picture of the protein structure emerges within their parameters. And what we can actually do is fit an equivariant head to the representations of the model and project out the atomic coordinates for each of the atoms in the protein. So that's what this slide is showing. And basically, as the model scales up, it gains a more and more accurate picture of protein structure. We were then able to use this to create a model for protein structure prediction. We call this ESM fold. And its key distinction from AlphaFold, so at the beginning I mentioned that AlphaFold uses this evolutionary principle. So actually the input to AlphaFold, the first step of AlphaFold is you give it a sequence, and then it performs a search across a large evolutionary database. It takes all those sequences, it aligns them against each other, and the input to the neural network itself is basically a collection of aligned sequences. And so the model's looking at this evolutionary family to make its prediction. So what ESM fold is able to do is actually make a prediction directly from the sequence. So the input to the model is the sequence. It's processed by the language model. And then there's a projection out into the structure. And this is interesting. So there are a few reasons why we're interested in doing this. So the first is speed. So it's very costly, basically, to perform this search across an evolutionary database. So state-of-the-art, high accuracy tools for that can take up to minutes, sometimes even 10 minutes to do that search. And so you can replace that basically with a single pass of forward pass of the language model. So that makes it extremely fast. And we were able to use this then to, so maybe just to highlight here that this is able to obtain state-of-the-art results. So the top bar chart there is the Cameo test set, and the lower bar chart is the Cas14 test set. And so accuracy or approaches that of AlphaFold is slightly less accurate than AlphaFold. We were able to use this then to actually do kind of a structural survey of a very large database of protein sequences. So people who do metagenomics research basically go out into the natural world and capture samples of microbes present in environments across the Earth. And they sequence basically the genes within all of those microbes. And so you have a survey basically of the proteins that have been created by nature. And very, very little is known about both the structure and function of these proteins. And so we were able to, because ESM fold is so fast, we were able in 2 weeks basically to fold an entire database of metagenomic proteins with over 600 million protein sequences in it, and really create the first kind of comprehensive survey of the structure of metagenomic proteins. So these are hundreds of millions of just completely diverse proteins from all over the world in different ecological niches and natural environments with just a vast range of different structures and functions. And so this is available in the ESM Atlas, and you can search this atlas and you can look at the structures of these functions, and you can also perform kind of large-scale search and comparative analysis of structure. So the other potential here for a model which goes directly from sequence to structure then is the ability basically to invert that model and to say, as we make changes in the sequence, how does that affect the predicted structure? And so with that, you can basically create a generative model that allows you to generate and design new proteins. And so one clear question that emerges when you think about that problem is, we've trained these models basically across all of evolution. And so to what extent can they generalize? To what extent can they go beyond the protein sequences that already exist in evolution that they've been trained on? And so this cartoon just kind of gives a depiction of protein space. It's vast. For a 200 length protein, there's 20 to the 200 possible sequences. And so evolution has explored just a very small part of this overall space. And the question is basically, can our language models move outside that region that evolution has already explored? Because that would be extremely important for their utility as a generative model. And so this slide shows that they can, in fact, do this. And so this is an example of a generative model that's constructed just using the probabilities that the language model assigns to each position in the sequence, and we can basically sample from a joint distribution of sequence and structure that's predicted by the model, and we can generate new diverse proteins. And so this is a projection of the structural space, and the proteins are colored by their distance from natural proteins in sequence space. So the dark ones are distant. And we actually put a number of these proteins to the test experimentally to see if they were folded or not. So each of the green stars represents a protein in this space that we tested experimentally. And the bar chart above basically shows both the test for solubility, that's in orange, and then in green, a test for well-foldedness by size exclusion and chromatography. And so we found a 55% success rate for free generations here overall. But really, the important question is what happens for those proteins that are really far outside the natural distribution of proteins. And so that's shown in this density plot. And so on the x-axis, basically, we searched each generated protein against all of the training data and natural proteins. And so anything that was less than 20% sequence identity is left of that red bar. And then we also predicted the structure for the nearest match in the natural protein space. And that's depicted on the y-axis. And so anything below the red line is predicted to be a different fold. And so within this quadrant, basically, of proteins that are really novel from a sequence standpoint, we also see a high experimental success rate, so 63% success rate. And so that's really suggesting that these models have learned some deep underlying design principle of the biology. So I'm going to end here. This is my last slide, and I just want to say something briefly about this. I think there's a really interesting idea here, and we've been, with natural language, I think there's a developing view that some of these models may be able to discover world models and simulate aspects of the world, when trained on enough textual data. And in biology, I think there's a really exciting potential for this, and I think these results hint at this potential, which is kind of the ultimate compression of sequence space really is the underlying biological principles, which are under selection by evolution. And so what that could mean really is that as we continue to scale up these models in data and parameters and compute, that we really might get to expect to see simulators of the biology that develop higher and higher levels of fidelity. And I think this ability to generalize, this ability to kind of learn the design principles, suggests that this interpretation. This is work by a large team, so the ESM team at Meta listed here, and then for the proteins that we tested experimentally, we collaborated with the Institute for Protein Design and with Basel Wiki and Lucas Miles.
promising. Thanks, Alex. Those are very interesting. Yeah, any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Very exciting work. Can you reverse the process? Can you start with a necessary function that you'd like to create from a protein and then work backwards to determine what amino acid sequence you would need to construct that protein and then do it?
So I think that should be possible. We focused on structure because I think for generalization, structure is really interesting because you can really quantify how far you've gone beyond natural proteins with structure. With function, of course, it's more difficult because most of the functions that we can measure are functions that natural proteins also have. So we really wanted to begin by addressing this question of generalizability, but I do think that the same principle will work for function. Yeah, and there are people in the in the biology community who are looking at this and seeing some success with using these types of language models for those problems. Especially for natural protein functions. You can use these models basically to suggest a series of variations on the protein basically that you can use as a library, which you can then test experimentally and look basically for changes in the sequence that improve the activity or improve other properties.
Yes, very nice talk. I'm trying to understand a bit more about how you extract the representation from the sequence. So is it that you take the attentional heat maps, essentially add them up and get a weighted graph out, and then you analyze the graph structure on a per-sequence basis, or is it something different?
So there's basically two things that were happening in the slides that I showed. So the first is the low-resolution picture of the contact map. So basically what we have is 660 attention heads. So we fit a regression basically to those heads. So we have 661 parameters because there's a bias. And then we use a very small number of structures to train that. So we use 20 structures, and I showed that you could even just use one structure to pull that out. So the idea is that there are many different attention heads in the model. Only some of them correlate with structure. The others are doing other things. We don't know what all of them are doing. So you can actually take the ones that just correlate with structure, and you can just visualize those directly. But you get a state-of-the-art structure, low-resolution structure predictor if you would basically fit this regression to the attention heads. So then the second thing that I talked about was really the high-resolution projection, where we're actually predicting the coordinates in 3D space for each of the atoms in the protein. So this is using an equivariant transformer. So this is the same type of module that AlphaFold invented, the invariant point attention. It's trained from scratch, so there's no, we're not using the weights of AlphaFold. We're taking a random network. So its input is going to be the hidden states of the transformer. So it's basically a length L sequence of vectors. That's going to be the input into the invariant point attention. And then that will be supervised with protein structures, basically, to learn this map from the hidden states to the 3D structure.
Great. Thank you very much.
Next question. While the mic goes to the next question, I actually had a question. What's the possibility of active learning in this field? Like, could you algorithmically choose a very small set of sequences to get folds for that would improve prediction on many sequences, fold prediction on many sequences?
Yeah, I think it's extremely exciting. And you can imagine kind of a self-improvement feedback loop in the model doing precisely this.
Right. Are people working on that? Is your stealth company working on that?
I mean, there are many people working on this right now, yeah.
I won't ask you if you're working on it. All right, go ahead.
So if we move beyond the question of structure similarity, and we try to look at modulating these structures. So we are designing, say, small molecule probes. So often we find that even if you have very large homology with, say, a certain protein, in the human case, the probe doesn't work. We have clinical failures. So when you have large language models create structures of the type you're doing, So at an RMS scale, secondary structure level, this is wonderful. But do these models then really scale to the point where we can use them to intelligently interface with these molecules and modulate them?
So the question is about really the interaction between small molecules and proteins? Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. There has been some work on this recently, not by our group, but the Rosetta group at the University of Washington has just created a model which can kind of jointly model the protein structure and ligands. It's a very challenging problem because we have 300,000 protein structures. We probably have thousands which have ligands, and so there's even less data for training this problem. I think there are a lot of interesting ways to approach this because, of course, we also have interesting simulators for docking, and so there may be a way actually to scale the data up for this task a lot. But this is still, I think, a very new, emerging area for these types of models.
Okay, I think we'll take the last question from the online audience. I'm sure lots of people are curious about this. Can you speak a bit more about the difference between your approach and that used by AlphaFold? And are there any other benefits besides perhaps the increased speed?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that maybe there's three things. So one would be, I think our team is focused on scale because if you just kind of look at the data that's out there, there's so much protein sequence data and there's so little structure data. And so if we could figure out basically, learning principles that worked well for protein sequence data, we could scale that a lot farther than we can a model which is learning on structures. So that's one thing. And what we've been able to show, and I guess I didn't have a slide on this, but we've been able to show scaling laws that are analogous to the scaling laws in NLP, which suggests that as we continue to scale these models, the accuracy is going to improve. So that's one thing I think we're really excited about.
So you haven't hit any diminishing returns yet?
Not yet, yeah. And I think there's still at least an order of magnitude more data that you can train these models on, and potentially more than that. So that's one sort of conceptual difference, I think, which may over time play out in an interesting way. The second thing, of course, is the speed. So we talked about that, and I think for certain applications, that's of immense value, especially if you're trying to do kind of a very large-scale structural survey. I think there's a lot to be learned from just the overall, the overall space of what nature has generated in terms of protein structure. So being able to expand, structural data by an order of magnitude is I think something that's predicted structural data by an order of magnitude is something that's valuable. But then the third thing, and really I only touched on it at the end of the talk, is the ability to design proteins. And so what I think you really want is a model that's invertible and it's fast enough to be in the inner loop of a design algorithm. And so as we want to construct these emergent neural simulators, you really need something where the input to that model is going to be the sequence itself, and the model really has some emergent understanding of how that sequence determines the structure, function, and other properties of the protein. And then once that's invertible, that gives us a very expressive, powerful model that can be used generatively to design new proteins.
Okay, very cool. I'm really excited to see what you do next. So let's take a break. We'll return at 11:35, so almost, but not quite a 10-minute break. And we'll shift gears to creativity. So 11:35, let's come back. Thanks.